Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to this next session of Fast Tracking Scotland Summit. We are in conversation this afternoon with Peter Krykant, but before we start and I introduce Peter, just a couple of housekeeping stuff. If you have never used Zoom before or never been on a Zoom webinar before, make sure you use the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your screen. This just helps us keep track of the questions that are submitted, and I can pose them to Peter. And also feel free to use the chat function if you've got any thoughts during the conversation, then please do post them in here. Make sure you use the all participants and attendees option just so that everyone can see them. If you want to make sure you're using the correct name on Zoom and you've not got a hangover from the weekend's Zoom quiz with the family, then do head into the participants screen and rename yourself. But don't worry, I'll not use any names against people. And also just a final note that our sponsors have made the Fast Tracking Scotland Summit possible, but have not endorsed, supported or paid any of the speakers nor influenced the content of the sessions. And with specific thanks to Gilead Sciences for making this summit possible. Now, I'm delighted to be here for the next 25 minutes with Peter, who is, as some of you will know, an activist, a volunteer, a committed person with a safe drug consumption van in Glasgow, which I'm sure, as long as you've not had a blindfold on over the last couple of months, you will have seen on TV or in the newspapers. So Peter, just maybe to introduce yourself to our attendees and those watching on replay, do you want to maybe introduce yourself and just talk a bit about your background and what got you in to doing the work that you're doing just now?
Yeah, thanks very much, Nathan. Thanks firstly for inviting me for this conversation today. To talk about the work that I'm doing, and yeah, my name's Peter Krykant, and just to give a little bit of background, well, to start from the beginning, I'm a former public injecting drug user, homeless drug user. Got involved in drug taking at a really young age. By 11, 12 years old, I was a daily drug user, and by the age of 17, I was injecting heroin, criminalised in and out the criminal justice system, homelessness. and public injecting drug use. And, fast forward 24 years later, and, the life that I have today is so far removed from that. I'm married, I've got two wonderful children, two wonderful dogs, an 8-week-old puppy. So if I've got some bags under my eyes, that's from the last week of having a new pug puppy in the house. But yeah, I mean, I thought a few years ago, after many years working in sales, I thought a few years ago I could use my lived experience of drug use to maybe go out and get a job and help others. So what I found out pretty quickly after doing that is that the situations that I was faced with 20 odd years ago are still pretty much the same. People are still injecting in dirty alleyways. They're still injecting under bridges, car parks. They're at high risk of bloodborne viruses and obviously high risk of death as well. Many people are found dead in our streets. And despite the fact that, there's been a big push to open a safe consumption facility in Glasgow for the last few years, directly linked to the HIV outbreak. That was the first reason that a drug consumption facility was actually spoken about. It's just never went forward. The UK government have dug their heels in. They're just not willing to, at this point, make those changes that people have been saying previously are required through the Misuse of Drugs Act to actually open a facility. So my last job was an HIV street outreach worker, providing rapid kit tests to people who are homeless injecting drug users. The organisation's fantastic. The people that work there are absolutely great, but I just personally couldn't do it anymore, Nathan. We were testing people on the streets of Glasgow, knowing no matter what harm reduction advice you give them, if they're homeless and they're injecting drug users, they're going to be at risk again. Later that day, they're going to be back in an abandoned building or a car park or a really horrible alleyway. So I just thought somebody needs to go ahead and do this, and that's the experience of other countries where we have officially sanctioned sites now, like Canada and Denmark, and I was lucky enough to visit Denmark and meet the people involved in the initial setup. I think Nana and Michael as well, and I got to see their van and the van that they use now, which is all kitted out. I've got a little bit of safe consumption van envy, to be honest, but they're obviously funded now. So, I was lucky to get to see the facility that they originally used and hear the experiences and the civil disobedience. And within a year, they got the framework and they now have the largest DCR in the world. So that's the hope here. It's been going since Overdose Awareness Day, 31st of August 2020. By Overdose Awareness Day 2021, the goal is to have an officially sanctioned site in Glasgow so that we can actually serve the 500 plus estimated publicly injecting drug users.
Now, in the opening plenary of this conference, Councillor Mary Hunter, who's responsible for health in Glasgow City Council, she chairs the Fast Track Cities leadership group in Glasgow too. She talked about the van, talked about the desire from the council and the Health and Social Care Partnership to have a safe drug consumption facility. But she also talked about the personal risks that you and your other volunteers have to face in order to just make it available. And she said it was unacceptable that you felt like you needed to make that personal risk down to the UK government not wanting to move their position. What was it that made you feel either confident enough or that, was it that you didn't feel like there was anything else that you could do? Because it is a measurable risk that you're taking operating the facility, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it is, but I think what's become apparent to me since I started this is the risk is not as high as what I initially thought, because specifically within the Misuse of Drugs Act, I don't believe that what we're doing is illegal in any way, shape or form. The Misuse of Drugs Act is just about to celebrate its 50th year, next year. And it doesn't talk about providing a safe space or a space for people to prepare heroin or cocaine to be injected. It talks about things like, cannabis, and that's why cannabis clubs have never been allowed to operate, and preparing opium to be smoked, but that's not what we are providing. So yeah, I mean, great risk initially. I thought I was going to be doing something illegal. I thought I'm going to be out here. I could get arrested. The first day that I took the van out, my legs were shaking each time I changed the gears, and I'm like nervous driving out. But the nerves have subsided, and I think actually now what I feel that I have, and we have, the volunteers have that are running the site, is a good working relationship with Police Scotland. It's like a partnership working relationship. Cumbernauld Police drove all the way out to see us last week because they thought we could connect them potentially to a missing person who's known to be a drug user, who's been missing from Cumbernauld. They came out to see us. Police, Greater Glasgow and Glasgow City Centre Police come out and see us regularly, and they talk to us about harm reduction. They talk to us about people who need support. We share information with them. The Simon community have come along and seen us now. It feels like we're being accepted as a service, and I appreciate what Mary Hunter says, and I appreciate Glasgow City's Council and the Health and Social Care Partnership and the Alcohol, Drug and Recovery Service all back a facility and the Integrated Joint Board. Where I feel we're at with this now is that the Scottish Government and the Lord Advocate need to back a facility. They've said that they back a facility, but how much do they actually back a facility? Because I think drug policy experts and legal experts are now are coming on into the same thinking that there's a will to, if there was a will to do this, we could get this done without a change to the Misuse of Drugs Act. So,
yeah, Mary also said something similar. I think they've now written again to the Lord Advocate to ask the Lord Advocate to change his position, which I think is obviously, there are formal processes, and that's hopefully a start of that request. But I think it's interesting what you just said there, because I've been looking around the UK, and different police and crime commissioners have allowed drug testing facilities at festivals, and and the necessary waiver or the police working with them rather than maybe arresting people that are in possession of drugs. Why is it that Scotland's maybe not taken that step? See in Newcastle or other police and crime commissioners allowing these testing services to exist. So I was surprised when the Lord Advocate didn't seem to follow what other devolved powers have had in England.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I mean, I think when you look at the way that the police force is set up in England, it's kind of like its own little devolved forces, isn't it? So you've got the West Midlands, and it's not like Scotland where it's Police Scotland as a whole, and essentially you've got one person who's in full control of the policing and crime, and unless that person steps in and makes a change or gives direction, nothing is going to change. The police in Scotland still need to abide by the law. That's the simple reality of, and that's the conversations that I have with individual officers on a weekly basis. Those officers that I speak to all say the same thing. The Misuse of Drugs Act's outdated. We can't work with it. And I think this could be a real egg on the face for the Scottish Government and the Lord Advocate, because what I feel could happen when Professor Dame Carol Black's report comes out, if there's any talk of drug consumption facilities and trials of drug consumption facilities, and if you look at Priti Patel's recent response to Joanna Cherry in the House of Parliament, it was the first time that she didn't outright dismiss it. The language changed a little bit there in terms of, we're looking to have pilots, and we're working on, and we're going to look at the Carol Black report. And I feel that what could happen is the UK government could say to an area like West Midlands, where they have a police and crime commissioner who's in support of drug consumption facilities, why don't you go ahead and do a pilot for the next 3 years? And if that's successful and it shows a reduction in crime, it shows a reduction in drug use, discarded equipment, less hospital admissions, then we'll look to incorporate a wider rollout with changes to the Misuse of Drugs Act. And if that happens, the Scottish Government and the Lord Advocate are going to look really silly, for want of a better word, because they've been saying now for a long time that this can't happen without a change to the Misuse of Drugs Act. So I really think it's time that, you know, they revisited it, and ultimately it's always been a sticking point, Nathan, about allowing people to work in a service, you know, an overdose prevention centre, because of the civil liabilities, and the Lord Advocate's spoken about that, but it's not the Lord Advocate's job to worry about that. Worry about the non-prosecution stance and allow the Scottish Government to deal with the liabilities under the Scottish Public Health Act 2008, you know, where it says in there specifically that we can allow, it's the Scottish Minister's duty to legislate to protect any part of the community, and it talks about things like infectious diseases, and you can put that within the HIV outbreak currently ongoing in Glasgow, that it would support, a DCR would support that. So there's legislation that can be brought in. There's previous precedents being set with non-prosecution stances around sex work in Scotland. The Lord Advocate's done some great work recently with the wider provision of naloxone. All we're asking is that he continues to do really good work.
And you've had political support from right across the like politics in Scotland, haven't you? I know that Paul Sweeney, who's a former Labour MP, has been out volunteering with you. Is it that political support that you think might get us over the line so that a state-operated facility can open?
Yeah, I think ultimately, I think what will get us over the line is a clear majority for the SNP government in the Scottish elections in May, and the appointment of a new Lord Advocate. You know, that's kind of, I mean, we couldn't get much more support, I feel. I think there's widespread support. I think you see people like Alison Thewlis and Ronnie Cowan and Ken McCaskill, Pete Wishart, I think Joanna Cherry. You know, I think most of those MPs who have been challenging the UK government for years know that we've hit a brick wall. And I think most of them would say, and some of them are actually publicly saying now, that we should go ahead and do this, and we should legislate through Holyrood for it. You know, we've had international backing from the Right Honourable Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister in New Zealand. You know, she's not some washed up former politician. You know, she's like chair of the Global Drug Commission policy, the Global Commission on Drugs Policy. She is, I think, just been appointed by the UN to evaluate the international response to coronavirus. You know, she's the sorts of people that you'd think that Nicola Sturgeon may listen to, because I ultimately feel that if something's going to give, it's going to have to be Nicola Sturgeon that comes forward at some point, because I just don't feel that, rightly or wrongly, that there's enough strong personalities in our cabinet or in our office just now to really say, right, we're going to do this. It needs to maybe be Hamza, Youssef, Nicola Sturgeon, you know, one of those guys to step forward and say, right, let's do it. The UK are going to break international law, aren't they? In a specific and limited way. So let's get it done, you know.
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A now, Peter, so I'll just ask these. How have people been able to access sterile injecting equipment during the pandemic? There's a lot of harm reduction services aren't offering drop-in services anymore, and potentially some people don't have the facilities to book appointments. What's been happening? How have you been helping with that?
Well, of course, when we're out, we provide the safe space, but we also provide clean injecting equipment. I think there's been good responses to keep things operating in Glasgow while the other pandemic has been ongoing, the coronavirus pandemic. You know, the harm reduction team and injecting equipment provision manager in Glasgow organised for you know, the bus to be out regularly and providing equipment and stuff within the city centre. So, you know, there's been a good response. Pharmacies have remained open, so people have been able to still get their equipment through the pharmacies. I think people have been getting encouraged to take more equipment, you know, when they've been moved on to maybe longer take-home doses of things like methadone. but they're still obviously using illicit drugs, taking more equipment with you. So I don't think the equipment is the issue. I think we've got a really good supply of injecting equipment provision, but if you give people who are living in homeless accommodation, who have that fear, if they go back to the homeless accommodation and use, they're going to end up rough sleeping again. Or if you give rough sleepers injecting equipment provision and you don't give them anywhere to use it, the reality is that they're either going to be at high risk of dying or high risk of bloodborne virus.
One of the thoughts that I had, and I discussed this with some other people before, was at the start of coronavirus, we had this sort of everybody in policy where it was about providing safe spaces for people, homeless people, to have a roof over their head, to protect them from coronavirus and give them the support that they needed. And that happened, I would have said, from the outside looking at it, at the start of the pandemic in March, April, it happened really well. But then what we had was almost a sort of the summer happened, the restrictions loosened, and then when the second wave of a lockdown happened, it didn't seem to me like there was that same impetus to support people. Is that the impression that you got? I know you said that you'd been out in the van since the end of August. That would have chimed to me like the same kind of time that the second sort of wave happened. Was that the same impression that you got?
Yeah, I just don't think that we were, when it all happened the first time and it was all like national lockdown and obviously it was really visible that people were out in the streets, that they were, homeless, drug use seemed a lot bigger than it was in Glasgow, or is, because the streets were so empty. So I think, yeah, rightly or wrongly, I just don't think we were as prepared the second time around, and it wasn't like the full-scale lockdown, so there wasn't as many organisations out there actually thinking we need to get everybody in. And I think things changed as well. So in the first lockdown, people without recourse to public funds were getting automatically housed and into accommodation, in hotel accommodation. And I think that was taken away, and it wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, some of the distressing things that I've seen, Nathan, is we've got, we recently seen this guy in a wheelchair, and he's got a 3-wheel wheelchair, and he's out in Glasgow city centre, and he's been sitting in this wheelchair for weeks, like with 3 wheels on it. He's already lost a leg through injecting drug use, and he's like, no, where's the action to just go and buy this guy a wheelchair, I had to go and buy it. We had to go and buy it through the money donated into us for the safe consumption facility to run. So there definitely needs to be more action. There needs to be more frontline service work, but it's difficult because of the budget cuts. They're still trying to catch up from 2016 when the Scottish Government cut the budgets.
So we've got 2 final questions. I can't believe we've nearly been here for 25 minutes already. But I know, Peter, that you are really active on Twitter, so people can find you on Twitter if they've got any follow-up questions. But two final questions. Have you noticed any self-stigma from people accessing your van? People maybe not wanting to be seen accessing it? Is there any stigma around themselves that you've noticed?
Certainly. I mean, people can find some of the best stories out there are sort of like one of the best stories. I think one of the best features was from the Vice. Vice ran an article, and the guy Matthew Busby who ran it, he just came on his own. So it was just him and me and another volunteer. So you really got to have conversations. And I think you can just see the underlying stigma that people have about themselves, like some of the quotes were along the lines of, I've never been treated like this before, like why, and the trauma and the suffering, and the guy, when I got him in the wheelchair, if we see him, we supervise his injections in the alleyway rather than in the van, because he can't get in and out because he's already lost a leg. And when we took him the wheelchair, it was like he was acting as if he didn't deserve to have a wheelchair with 4 wheels on it. And that's the underlying stuff. I don't think there's a stigma about actually using the van. People are generally like really pleased, especially at this time of the year, just to have somewhere that's a bit warmer, that there's good light in, that there's a comfortable seat to sit in. And they can get somebody to talk to, especially people that are on their own, that are using on their own. They can sit for 5-10 minutes, they can talk to myself or some of the other volunteers, So yeah, the stigma is more about a self-stigma around, I don't deserve to be treated like this, and I think that's just a case of society said for so long that you're a bad person for doing what you're doing. That's what we say to people, you need to hide because you're bad. And despite the fact that you started injecting heroin when you were 15, you're now 20 years old, you're covered in self-harm scars, you're sleeping in a tent outside Glasgow Sheriff Court, and you're injecting heroin in your groin, and you were beaten and abused as a child, and you started injecting at 15, automatically, as soon as you start injecting heroin at 15, to try and escape all that trauma, society says, actually, no, you're just bad. You need to hide away from us, and if you're, and then you need to go to prison. That's what society says. So it's self-stigma, yeah.
And so our final question, and I've left this one deliberately to the end. What's your hope and vision for service or services or vans or facilities? It's obviously not going to. It's not just about having one. I think. What's your vision for what that would consist of in terms of support, as well as being a safe place to use? What in about 60 seconds, what do you think your vision is for that?
I think initially I would just like to see a low-tech space. So a low-tech space to supervise injections, connect people into support services, and then further down the line, after a period of evaluation and monitoring outcomes, I'd like to see something like the medically supervised injections facility in Sydney, and you can go online and catch the 3-minute YouTube video about that. Oral health, GPs, psychologists, housing, health and welfare, connecting people into heroin-assisted treatment. I'd like to see a city like Geneva where older drug users are given retirement homes and injectable diamorphine to use, because there's no point in trying to force them into abstinence-based recovery at 65, 70-year-old. And we've supervised people of that age in our van. It's time to give these people a safe, the dignity and respect and that they need. A DCR can connect so many other services. We say it's not a silver bullet, but for me, it's one of the key core issues that that would help us connect people into other services that have never been involved with services before. Sorry if that was over.
No, don't. But no, I think that's a wonderful vision to have, and hopefully we can get there. The next 3 days of this conference will allow us to do some of that talking and thinking about how we can deal with the outbreak of HIV among people who use drugs, but some of the bigger questions as well. So I'm delighted that you could join us today, Peter, for that conversation. I can't believe that we've gone through half an hour already. It feels like we've only been talking for a few minutes, but I'm sure we'll keep up the conversation. The Twitter is there for people that want to get in touch with Peter, ask him some questions, use the hashtag FastTrackScott, and we'll pass on any questions to Peter as well. But just once again, Peter, thank you so much. Thanks for what you're doing, and we'll see you again soon.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Nathan.
Thanks, everyone.